Today we're diving into what might be the most literal, cursed chamber in human history. Picture this: November 26, 1922. Deep beneath the Egyptian desert, a small hole is punched through an ancient doorway that has been sealed for over 3,000 years. The first breath of outside air in 30 centuries flows into a pitch-black chamber. And with that breath, something flows back out. Something that has been waiting. Something patient. Something deadly. This is the tomb of Tutankhamun, and in the months and years that followed its opening, the people who entered this chamber began to die, one by one, in ways that defied explanation. Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's wealthy patron, dead within months from a mysterious infection that baffled doctors. Arthur Mace, the archaeologist who helped break down the tomb's walls, dead from sudden exhaustion. George J. Gould, American financier who visited the tomb, dead from fever after just one trip inside. The list goes on and on and on. So here's our question. How does a room that's been sealed since the Bronze Age manage to kill people in the 20th century? Is this really an ancient curse, or is something far more sinister waiting in the darkness of that chamber? Because today, we're going to step inside that tomb. We're going to examine what was really lurking in those shadows, and we're going to discover that sometimes the most deadly curses aren't written in hieroglyphs. They're floating in the air you breathe. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where the most dangerous room in history wasn't built by ghosts, it was built by time itself. Before we descend into the tomb, I'm curious, where in the world are you guys listening to this from? Drop a comment and let us know what corner of the globe this crazy story has reached. And if this tomb's track record is any indication, hopefully you're somewhere with good ventilation. To understand how a 3,000-year-old burial chamber managed to become history's most patient serial killer, you first have to understand the absolutely bonkers world that created it. We're talking about Egypt in 1922 during what historians call the Golden Age of Archaeology, though it might be more accurate to call it the era when grave robbing had a PhD and was funded by rich British lords. Egypt, 1922. The place where Lawrence of Arabia was still making headlines, where the British Empire was at its peak, and where wealthy Europeans treated ancient burial sites like their personal treasure chests. This was a time when archaeological methodology consisted of smash first, catalog later, and your safety equipment was a pith helmet and a stiff upper lip. Imagine if breaking into a CDC biolab was considered a gentleman's hobby, and your protection against unknown biological hazards was basically hoping for the best. It's like modern healthcare. Lots of confidence, questionable actual protection. The Valley of the Kings wasn't just some random desert cemetery. This was the ultimate ancient security system, a necropolis carved into the mountains where Egypt's most powerful pharaohs were buried with literally everything they owned. The ancient Egyptians had spent centuries perfecting the art of hiding their dead kings in a landscape that looked like the surface of Mars, had a baby with a geology textbook. Hidden entrances, elaborate death traps, and enough curses carved into the walls to make a horror movie screenwriter weep with joy. But here's what makes this story particularly terrifying. Egyptian mummification wasn't just about preservation. It was about creating a hermetically sealed biological environment. Think of each tomb as a time capsule, but instead of preserving memories, it was preserving death for thousands of years. The mummification process involved removing the organs, stuffing the body with preservative spices, and wrapping everything in resin-soaked bandages. Then they sealed the whole thing in nested coffins, inside a stone sarcophagus, inside a tomb, that was then sealed with limestone blocks. It was like creating the world's most elaborate biological weapon, except they didn't know they were doing it. Now let's meet our players in this tragic comedy of errors. First, we have Howard Carter, our obsessive protagonist. Carter was a brilliant archaeologist who had spent decades in Egypt breathing tomb dust like other people breathe morning coffee. This was a man so dedicated to his work that he'd been digging in the Valley of the Kings for years, convinced that one more tomb lay hidden beneath the sand. He was stubborn, meticulous, and had the kind of single-minded determination that either makes you a genius or gets you killed. In Carter's case, it might have been both. Then we have Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy British aristocrat funding this entire operation. Think of him as the 1920s equivalent of a tech billionaire with a dangerous hobby, except instead of going to space, he was digging up death chambers. Carnarvon had money to burn and a fascination with Egypt that bordered on obsession. The problem was he was already in poor health. A car accident years earlier had left him with a weakened immune system and chronic health problems. In other words, he was exactly the wrong person to be breathing in 3,000-year-old tomb air. Supporting them was an international team of archaeologists, photographers, and workmen who would enter the tomb in those first crucial weeks. These were serious professionals, the best in their field. They just had no idea what they were walking into. And finally, we have our silent antagonist, the tomb itself. Picture a 3,000-year-old sealed environment that had been slowly cooking in the desert heat, creating a chemical and biological cocktail that would make a hazmat team think twice. This wasn't just a room with some old stuff in it. This was a chamber where death itself had been fermenting for longer than Christianity had existed. If this sounds fascinating and you want to see where this investigation leads, hit that like button. It really helps us dig deeper into these historical mysteries. Because what happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see coming. The story of how this ancient death chamber was opened unfolds like a 3-act tragedy, where each act brings our heroes closer to a fate they never saw coming. It begins with years of obsessive searching, a quest that would make Captain Ahab look like a casual weekend fisherman. Howard Carter had been digging in the Valley of the Kings since 1907, funded by Lord Carnarvon's deep pockets and equally deep patience. For 15 years, they found nothing. Well, not exactly nothing, but nothing that justified the massive expense of the operation. By 1922, even Carnarvon was getting antsy. He'd spent the equivalent of millions in today's money watching Carter move sand from one pile to another. It was like funding the world's most expensive archaeological lottery, and they kept losing. Carter's obsession with finding that one undiscovered tomb had become legendary among his colleagues. While other archaeologists were content to study known sites or make incremental discoveries, Carter was convinced that the Valley of the Kings still held one major secret. He had studied every tomb, mapped every excavation, and calculated the probability that at least one royal burial remained hidden beneath the debris of centuries. The logic was sound, if desperate. Tutankhamun was known from historical records, a pharaoh who had ruled briefly during one of Egypt's most turbulent periods. But his tomb had never been found. Other pharaohs from his era had elaborate burial sites that had been discovered and plundered centuries ago. Where was the boy king? By late 1922, Carter was down to his last chance. Carnarvon had given him one final season to find something, anything, that would justify the continued expense. The pressure was enormous. Carter knew that if he didn't find something significant, his career would be over, and decades of work would amount to nothing more than the world's most expensive hole-digging project. And then on November 4th, 1922, everything changed. One of Carter's water boys, a young Egyptian named Hussein Abdel Rasul, discovered something that would make history. While fetching water for the dig site, he noticed that his jar was making a hollow sound as he set it down. Investigating further, he found a step cut into the rock, barely visible beneath centuries of accumulated debris. Carter's heart must have stopped when he saw that step. After 15 years of disappointment, this was it, the first sign of what could be an undisturbed tomb. But Carter was too experienced to get his hopes up immediately. False alarms were common in archaeology. Stone steps could lead to nothing more than ancient storage rooms or workers' quarters. What followed was 3 weeks of the most agonizing excavation in archaeological history. Carter and his team carefully cleared step after step, revealing a descending staircase cut directly into the bedrock. 16 steps in total, leading down to a sealed doorway. And on that doorway, they found something that made their blood run cold and their hearts race simultaneously. The seal of the necropolis was there, the mark that indicated this tomb was under the official protection of the ancient authorities. But more importantly, they found the cartouche of Tutankhamun, the hieroglyphic signature of the boy king who had died over 3,000 years earlier. This wasn't just any tomb. This was the burial place they had been searching for. But there was something else. Evidence that ancient grave robbers had been there before them. Small holes in the doorway had been resealed with different types of mortar, indicating that thieves had broken in at some point in antiquity, been discovered, and the tomb had been resealed by ancient authorities. The question was, what, if anything, had they left behind? On November 26, 1922, Carter made the decision that would change his life and end several others. He carefully chipped a small hole in the upper corner of the doorway and held up a candle to peer inside. The hot air rushing out of the tomb made the candle flame flicker wildly, creating dancing shadows that made it almost impossible to see clearly. Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him in the narrow stairwell, asked the question that would become legend, "Can you see anything?" Carter's reply was immortal. Yes, wonderful things. But what Carter couldn't see in that flickering candlelight, what none of them understood in that moment of triumph, was that he had just broken a seal that had protected the tomb for 30 centuries. That small hole wasn't just letting light in, it was letting something out. Something that had been waiting patiently in the darkness, something that had been brewing and concentrating and growing more deadly with each passing year. The next day, they enlarged the hole enough to squeeze through, and what they found was beyond their wildest dreams. The antechamber was packed floor to ceiling with the most incredible collection of artifacts anyone had ever seen. Golden chariots with intricate carvings, ivory-inlaid chests, ceremonial beds guarded by golden leopards, life-size statues of the king, and treasures that represented the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian craftsmanship. But this was just the appetizer. The real prize lay beyond another sealed doorway, the burial chamber itself. Carter spent months carefully cataloging and removing the artifacts from the antechamber before he dared to breach that final barrier. The anticipation was killing him, but his archaeological training demanded patience and methodical documentation. On February 17, 1923, they finally broke through that last sealed doorway and found themselves in the burial chamber proper. What they discovered there was the archaeological equivalent of winning every lottery in the world simultaneously. 4 golden shrines nested one inside the other, protecting a series of coffins that contained the mummy of Tutankhamun himself. The outermost shrine was massive, filling almost the entire burial chamber. Inside that was another shrine, then another, then finally, a stone sarcophagus containing 3 nested coffins. The outermost coffin was carved from a single piece of yellow quartzite. Inside that was a wooden coffin covered in gold leaf and precious stones. And inside that was the prize, a coffin made of solid gold containing the mummy of the boy king. But here's what makes this discovery particularly ominous in hindsight. Every time they opened another container, every time they broke another seal, they were releasing more of whatever had been trapped inside. The ancient Egyptians had created a series of nested environments, each one sealed and preserved separately. Opening them was like opening a series of Russian dolls, except each doll contained concentrated death. Each breach released gases that had been trapped for millennia, chemical compounds from the mummification process, organic vapors from decomposing materials, spores and bacteria that had been lying dormant in the perfect preservation conditions. With every seal they broke, Carter and his team were breathing in history, literally inhaling the concentrated essence of ancient death. At this point, a rational person might have thought, you know what? Maybe we should test the air quality before spending months working in this sealed environment. But this was 1922, when the prevailing scientific attitude toward unknown biological hazards was essentially, what's the worst that could happen? Basically the same energy as opening your 401k statement after a market crash and assuming everything will be fine. The team spent months in that tomb working by candlelight and primitive electric bulbs, breathing in air that had been sealed since before the fall of Rome. They handled artifacts that had been soaked in preservative chemicals for 3 millennia. They unwrapped mummy bandages that released clouds of organic dust. And they did all of this without masks, without ventilation systems, without any of the safety protocols that modern archaeologists consider absolutely essential. The irony is that they thought they were being careful. Carter was famous for his meticulous documentation and his respect for archaeological proper procedure, but their definition of careful focused entirely on preserving the artifacts, not on protecting the archaeologists. They were so focused on not damaging the treasures of the past that they never considered that the past might be damaging them. Which brings us to the most ominous part of our story, the pattern of death that began almost immediately after the tomb's opening. It started with what seemed like minor incidents, team members complaining of headaches, fatigue, respiratory problems, nothing that seemed connected to their work. Nothing that 1920s medicine would have recognized as symptoms of environmental poisoning. But then Lord Carnarvon, the man who had funded the entire expedition, suddenly fell seriously ill. And that's when the real nightmare began. All right, time to put on our detective hats and examine this case with the cold, analytical eye of modern science. We've heard the stories, we've seen the pattern of death, and we've watched as one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history turned into what appeared to be a supernatural murder spree. Now it's time to step into that tomb ourselves and find out what was really waiting in the darkness. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here to determine whether the curse of Tutankhamun is supernatural nonsense or scientific fact. The prosecution will show that what happened in that tomb was no accident, no coincidence, and certainly no curse in the traditional sense. What happened was far more terrifying. It was the inevitable result of human arrogance meeting ancient chemistry in a confined space. Let the historical autopsy begin. First, let's establish what the defense has been claiming for the past century. The official story, the mainstream explanation that archaeologists and historians have been peddling, goes something like this: the deaths were nothing more than an incredible series of coincidences amplified by media sensationalism and the power of suggestion. Lord Carnarvon was already in poor health. Arthur Mace was elderly. The other deaths were either unrelated to the tomb or can be explained by the normal hazards of working in Egypt in the 1920s. It's a neat, tidy explanation that allows everyone to sleep soundly at night and keeps tourists visiting Egyptian museums without worry. The scientific establishment loves this explanation because it doesn't require them to admit that they might have missed something important. The only problem with this theory is that it's complete and utter nonsense. Because when you actually examine the evidence, the real scientific evidence, a very different picture emerges. A picture so disturbing that it makes the supernatural explanation look downright comforting by comparison. What we're about to reveal will show that Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't protected by angry spirits or ancient magic. It was protected by something far more reliable: chemistry, biology, and time. Let's start with Exhibit A, the death chamber's atmosphere. When Carter's team broke that first hole in the tomb's seal on November 26, 1922, they weren't just letting in fresh air. They were releasing a chemical cocktail that had been brewing in perfect isolation for over 3,000 years. Think about what happens when you seal any room for an extended period. The air gets stale moisture, builds up, things start to decay. Now multiply that process by 30 centuries and add Egyptian mummification chemicals to the mix. The ancient Egyptians used a sophisticated mummification process that involved removing the internal organs and stuffing the body cavity with preservative materials. These weren't just simple spices and herbs. We're talking about natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate. Tree resins that release formaldehyde as they break down. Aromatic oils that contain complex organic compounds. Beeswax that can off-gas various chemicals as it ages. All of these materials had been sealed in an airtight environment for 3 millennia, slowly breaking down and releasing their chemical components into the tomb's atmosphere. The result was a concentrated soup of potentially toxic compounds. Ammonia from decomposing organic matter, the same stuff that makes household cleaning products so dangerous in enclosed spaces. Hydrogen sulfide gas that smells like rotten eggs and can cause respiratory failure at high concentrations. And yes, formaldehyde, the same chemical used in modern embalming that requires hazmat gear to handle safely. But the chemical soup was just the beginning. The tomb had also been suffering from severe oxygen depletion. When you seal any space for thousands of years, the oxygen gets consumed by chemical reactions and bacterial processes, leaving behind elevated levels of carbon dioxide and other gases. Carter and his team weren't just entering a tomb. They were entering what was essentially a gas chamber that had been marinating for longer than recorded human history. Modern atmospheric analysis of similar sealed Egyptian tombs has revealed oxygen levels as low as 10%, compared to the normal atmospheric level of 21%. At those concentrations, you start experiencing symptoms similar to altitude sickness, headaches, fatigue, confusion, and eventually unconsciousness. And that's assuming the air doesn't contain any actively toxic compounds, which in Tutankhamun's case, it almost certainly did. Now let's examine Exhibit B, the biological time bomb. This is where things get truly terrifying, because the ancient Egyptians had unknowingly created the perfect environment for cultivating and preserving deadly microorganisms. The mummy wrappings made from linen soaked in tree resins and other organic materials provided an ideal breeding ground for fungi and bacteria that can remain viable for incredibly long periods under the right conditions. Modern microbiological analysis of ancient Egyptian mummies and their wrappings has revealed the presence of numerous potentially dangerous organisms. Aspergillus niger, a particularly nasty fungus that can cause respiratory infections, allergic reactions, and even death in people with compromised immune systems. Aspergillus flavus, which produces aflatoxins, some of the most potent carcinogens known to science. Various species of penicillium, which while famous for giving us antibiotics, can also cause severe respiratory problems in high concentrations. Remember, Lord Carnarvon already had a severely weakened immune system from his car accident years earlier. Walking into that tomb was like walking into a biological weapon specifically designed to target his particular vulnerabilities. It's like walking into a house that's had a severe mold problem since the Trojan War, except the mold has been perfectly preserved and concentrated for maximum potency. Even your homeowner's insurance would laugh and hang up on that claim. But Aspergillus and penicillium weren't the only microscopic monsters waiting in the darkness. Ancient organic materials can harbor bacteria that become airborne when disturbed, which is exactly what happened every time Carter's team moved an artifact or unwrapped a section of mummy bandages. They were releasing clouds of potentially deadly microorganisms that had been perfectly preserved for millennia, like opening a time capsule full of concentrated plague. This brings us to Exhibit C, the toxic treasure trove. The ancient Egyptians weren't content to just use harmless spices and flowers in their mummification process. They employed a sophisticated array of chemical preservatives that would make a modern toxicologist break out in a cold sweat. Mercury-based compounds were commonly used in the mummification process, particularly in the preparation of internal organs. Arsenic-based paints and dyes were used extensively for decorating tomb walls, sarcophagi, and burial goods. These heavy metals don't just disappear over time, they accumulate in the environment and in human tissue. Every breath Carter's team took in that tomb was potentially exposing them to toxic levels of mercury and arsenic. And unlike acute poisoning, which kills you quickly, and obviously chronic exposure to these substances causes a slow, mysterious decline that would have completely baffled 1920s medical professionals. The symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning read like a checklist of what many tomb team members experienced: fatigue, depression, respiratory problems, neurological issues, and eventually organ failure leading to death. Arsenic poisoning presents similarly: chronic fatigue, respiratory problems, skin lesions, and eventually cardiovascular collapse. To doctors in the 1920s, these would have appeared to be mysterious, unrelated illnesses rather than symptoms of environmental poisoning. But here's the truly terrifying part that nobody talks about. Some of the ceremonial objects in Tutankhamun's tomb may have contained naturally radioactive materials. The ancient Egyptians had access to minerals from across their vast empire, including some that we now know emit dangerous levels of radiation. Certain types of pottery glazes, metallic compounds, and even some of the pigments used in tomb paintings can contain naturally occurring radioactive elements. Handling these artifacts day after day for months during the excavation process could have exposed Carter's team to significant radiation doses, another condition that 1920s medicine was completely unprepared to diagnose, understand, or treat. The ancient Egyptians had accidentally created the world's first dirty bomb, except Instead of getting evacuated by hazmat teams, people were paying money to get inside and handle the radioactive materials with their bare hands. Finally, let's examine Exhibit D, the perfect storm of vulnerability. The deaths that followed the tomb's opening weren't random. They followed a pattern that reveals the true nature of the threat and demolishes any argument for coincidence. Lord Carnarvon was the first and most dramatic victim, precisely because he was the most vulnerable. His immune system, already compromised by his earlier car accident, made him the perfect target for biological agents that might not significantly affect a healthy person. But even the healthier members of the team weren't safe because they spent months in prolonged intensive exposure to this toxic environment. The archaeological process in 1922 was slow, meticulous, and involved spending long hours in the tomb itself. Carter's team worked by candlelight and primitive electric bulbs in an unventilated underground chamber, handling contaminated artifacts and breathing concentrated doses of toxins that had been building up for 30 centuries. They were essentially working in an unventilated chemical plant without safety equipment, conducting what amounted to a months-long experiment in human toxicology. Modern archaeologists wear more protective gear than hospital workers. During COVID, use sophisticated air filtration systems and conduct extensive atmospheric testing before entering any sealed ancient chamber. Turns out ancient death traps require modern safety standards. Who would have thought? And here's the final nail in the coffin of the coincidence theory. 1920s medicine was spectacularly unprepared to deal with these types of environmental health threats. Doctors had virtually no concept of environmental toxicity, no understanding of chronic chemical exposure, and no ability to diagnose conditions caused by ancient biological agents. When someone died from mercury poisoning, fungal infection, or radiation exposure, it was labeled as exhaustion, mysterious fever, or heart failure, because those were literally the only diagnostic categories available. So here's the truth that'll make you think twice before opening any ancient sealed chambers. Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't cursed by angry spirits or vindictive gods. It was cursed by ancient chemistry, biology, and physics. The pharaohs didn't need supernatural powers to protect their burial chambers from grave robbers. They had something far more reliable and far more deadly. 3,000 years of perfectly preserved concentrated death, just waiting for some overconfident archaeologists to come along and take a deep breath. The ancient Egyptians had accidentally created what amounts to the world's first chemical weapon, except instead of deploying it on a battlefield, they buried it in the desert and waited for time to make it even more deadly. They built the ultimate cursed chamber, not with magic spells and supernatural forces, but with chemistry, biology, and patience. And when Carter's team broke that ancient seal, they didn't just disturb the dead. They released a monster that had been waiting in perfect preservation for over 3,000 years. The case file is closed. The evidence has been examined. The verdict is in. Tutankhamun's tomb was indeed a killer, not through supernatural means, but through a perfect storm of biological and chemical hazards that created the world's most patient murder weapon. The ancient Egyptians had unknowingly built a death trap so sophisticated that it makes modern chemical weapons look like children's toys. But here's the truly fascinating part. This discovery changed everything. When archaeologists finally figured out what had really happened in that tomb, it revolutionized the entire field. Modern archaeological safety protocols exist because of Tutankhamun. Today's archaeologists wear protective equipment that would make a hazmat team jealous, and they test air quality before entering any sealed chamber. The birth of bioarchaeology, the study of ancient biological materials and their potential hazards, can be traced directly back to the mysterious deaths that followed the tomb's opening. The irony is almost poetic. We learned to respect ancient dangers just as we began to understand them. For thousands of years, people had avoided disturbing Egyptian tombs because of superstitious fear. Then science came along, dismissed the superstitions as nonsense, and promptly walked straight into a death trap that the ancients had been warning about all along. It's like finally having the technology to read a danger toxic waste sign, and then deciding that means it's safe to throw a pool party. But the legacy of Tutankhamun's tomb extends far beyond archaeological safety protocols. It fundamentally changed how we think about ancient civilizations. The idea that Bronze Age Egyptians could accidentally create a chemical weapon that remained lethal for 3 millennia forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about ancient technology and knowledge. The tomb also revealed something profound about the relationship between preservation and destruction. The very techniques that allowed Tutankhamun's burial goods to survive intact for thousands of years, the airtight sealing, the chemical preservatives, the careful environmental control, were the same techniques that made the tomb a biological weapon. Perfect preservation requires perfect isolation, and perfect isolation creates perfect conditions for brewing concentrated death. This principle extends far beyond archaeology. Every time we try to preserve something perfectly, we create conditions that can become dangerous over time. Ancient wine can ferment into vinegar that'll burn your throat. Sealed historical documents can off-gas chemicals that damage your lungs. Even modern preservation techniques can create hazardous environments. Ask anyone who's ever opened a really old can of food and lived to regret it. The story of Tutankhamun's tomb is also a humbling reminder about the limits of human knowledge. The archaeologists who entered that tomb were among the most educated, sophisticated people of their era. They had access to the best medical knowledge of the 1920s, cutting-edge technology, and decades of experience. And they walked straight into a death trap because they were overconfident in their understanding of the dangers they faced. It's a humbling reminder that sometimes the ancients knew things we're still figuring out, kind of like how your grandmother's home remedies somehow work better than anything from CVS. The ancient Egyptians may not have understood germ theory or chemical toxicity in the way we do, but they understood that disturbing the dead was dangerous. Their curses and warnings weren't superstitious nonsense. They were practical safety advice dressed up in religious language. The real curse of Tutankhamun's tomb is this: it shows us that death, when properly preserved, becomes a weapon that transcends time. The ancient Egyptians built the ultimate cursed chamber, not with magic spells, but with chemistry, biology, and patience. They created a room where death itself could wait for thousands of years, perfectly preserved and ready to claim anyone foolish enough to disturb its slumber. And here's the most terrifying part: there are probably hundreds of similar chambers still sealed beneath the Egyptian desert. Tombs that have been brewing their deadly cocktails for millennia, just waiting for the next team of overconfident archaeologists to break the seal and take a deep breath. Every time we open an ancient chamber, we're rolling the dice with forces we still don't fully understand. The most terrifying curses aren't supernatural, they're scientific. They're written in the language of chemistry and biology, and they're still waiting in the darkness beneath our feet. Tutankhamun's tomb taught us that the past isn't just another country, it's a potentially hostile one, armed with weapons we're only beginning to understand. So, what do you think? Were those deaths really just coincidence, or did Carter and his team stumble into history's most effective death trap? Let us know in the comments, and while you're down there, hit that like button if this story gave you a new appreciation for modern safety regulations. And if you want to explore more chambers where ancient science meets modern mystery, subscribe to Cursed Chambers and ring that notification bell. Trust us, some doors were never meant to be opened, but we're going to open them anyway. The past is waiting, and sometimes it's still very much alive.